Jade Morgan's heels clicked softly against the polished stone as she stepped out of the sleek black sedan, her silhouette cutting a striking figure against the golden glow of the Whitmore estate. Dressed in a tailored navy suit that hugged her frame with quiet authority, she paused for a breath, smoothing the front of her blazer. Her fingers trembled ever so slightly, not from fear but from the weight of the moment. This wasn't just another meeting. This was the culmination of years spent climbing walls built from glass, steel, and bias. Tonight was supposed to be a victory. The estate loomed before her like a monument to old wealth, its grand columns and sprawling lawns speaking in hushed tones of generational privilege. The kind of place where power wasn't discussed, it was assumed. The kind of place where every portrait on the wall looked the same. As the heavy front doors opened with a quiet creak, Jade was greeted by a butler whose face was pleasant but unreadable, his bow almost imperceptible. She followed him down a hallway that smelled faintly of aged wood, leather, and expensive wine, her heels muffled now by a Persian runner that seemed older than her entire company. She entered the ballroom to a soft hush, the kind that seems accidental but isn't. Conversations faltered. A string quartet played in the corner, their bows dancing on strings, but even the music felt like background to something colder, something watching. Dozens of eyes turned toward her, curious, assessing. Her skin prickled under their gaze. Jade was used to boardrooms and venture capital summits, to standing her ground in spaces where she was the only woman, often the only black person, in the room. But this was different. Here, every crystal chandelier and pearl necklace seemed to whisper that she didn't belong. Still she smiled. A waiter passed with a silver tray of champagne flutes. She took one with practiced poise, letting the bubbles rise as she scanned the room for a familiar face. The Whitmore family lawyer had arranged this dinner to celebrate the partnership, though it felt more like a performance. Jade caught sight of Charles Whitmore Sr., the patriarch, surrounded by executives in tuxedos and women in dresses that looked like they had never heard the word budget. He offered a nod, slow and measured, but made no move toward her. She was left to approach alone. The laughter started like a ripple, light and scattered, until it concentrated at the center of the room. Charles Whitmore Jr. stood there, glass in hand, tall and smiling in that careless way men born into power often are. His voice rang out over the low murmur of the crowd. Did someone let the help in early? For a beat the room froze. And then, an eruption of nervous chuckles, some muffled behind hands, others full-throated, unashamed. Jade stood still. The champagne flute remained in her hand, steady as stone. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. A flicker, a fracture. The pain was sharp, but short-lived. Humiliation had long ago learned to be quiet around her. She did not flinch. She did not speak. She simply walked forward with grace and offered a polite, practiced smile, one that concealed the firestorm building behind her composure. No one stopped him. No one corrected him. And Charles Sr. said nothing at all. That was when she knew. The money might have been modern, but the mindset was still centuries old. So Jade raised her chin slightly, offered a soft, "Excuse me," and walked out before dessert was served. And just like that, what was meant to be a celebration became a silent declaration, one that would echo far louder in the days to come. The echo of Charles Jr.'s words hadn't left the marble walls before the laughter began, soft at first, then swelling, rippling through the room like a cruel tide. Some tried to stifle it, covering their mouths with slender fingers adorned with heirloom rings, while others let the amusement slip freely past champagne-drenched lips. And yet, what pierced Jade the most wasn't the laughter. It was the silence that followed. The silence of complicity. Not a single voice rose in protest. Not even a murmur of discomfort. They all just watched her, some with idle curiosity, others with masked disdain. It wasn't just the insult itself. It was the way it settled over the room like something normal, expected. As if a black woman in a suit could only ever be mistaken for help. As if she didn't belong, not really. Not in their ballroom. Not at their table. Jade stood frozen in that moment, but not from shock. No, she was far too familiar with the weapon of polished disrespect. This wasn't her first encounter with veiled derision hidden behind designer smiles. But there was something about this setting, the chandeliers casting golden halos above a crowd that saw her as nothing more than a disruption in their generational ritual, that dug deeper. It was the audacity of it, the gall of being ridiculed not in secret, not in whispers but publicly, boldly, as if her dignity were a disposable napkin at their gilded table. Her fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her champagne flute. The glass, still full, trembled ever so slightly. Her expression remained neutral, controlled. Years of navigating rooms like this had trained her face to mask the war waging inside. Rage, shame, disbelief. It all surged under her skin, but she wouldn't let them see it. Wouldn't give them that. Charles Jr., still grinning like a man who'd just told the world's cleverest joke, tilted his glass in a mock toast. No offense, of course, he added with a wink, the kind that dripped with mockery. We're all family tonight, aren't we? She didn't answer. Her silence was not submission. It was strategy. Jade turned her gaze toward Charles Sr., hoping, expecting, some gesture of correction, a word, even a look. But the patriarch of the Whitmore Empire simply sipped his wine. His eyes distant, detached. Whether from cowardice or quiet agreement, his inaction spoke just as loudly as his son's insult. It was then, amidst the glitter and grandeur, that a decision began to crystallize in Jade's mind. Not in anger but in clarity. A moment that started as humiliation was quickly becoming something else. A line. A boundary, drawn in invisible ink, that she would never allow them to cross again. She straightened her shoulders and exhaled softly. Her gaze swept the room one last time, meeting eyes that quickly darted away. Then, without another word, she set her untouched glass on the edge of a silver-plated tray, turned, and walked with quiet grace toward the towering doors that had first welcomed her. Each step was a statement, each movement a refusal. She didn't need to stay to prove her worth. Her presence alone had already unsettled the fragile foundation of their arrogance. And though she left in silence, her absence would soon speak volumes. What they didn't realize yet was that the woman they had laughed at wasn't just the CEO of a rising empire. She was the future they were too blind to see. And now they had mocked it, and let it walk out the door. Would you like to move forward to part 3? The bold decision next. The night air was cooler than she expected as Jade stepped outside the Whitmore estate, the stone steps beneath her heels echoing like punctuation marks in a sentence she had not yet spoken aloud. Her driver opened the car door, his eyes searching hers with a quiet question he didn't dare voice. She nodded silently, slipping into the back seat as the door clicked shut behind her. Inside, alone with the soft hum of the engine and the gentle rhythm of tires on asphalt, Jade let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since the moment that room turned against her. She didn't cry. There were no tears, not because she wasn't hurt, but because the pain had matured. It had learned to sit still, to breathe with her, to burn in the belly without rising to the eyes. She stared out at the blur of city lights as the car glided through the night, her reflection in the glass looking back with a quiet, resolute strength. The Whitmores thought they knew power. They believed it lived in estates and stock portfolios, in surnames embroidered on linen and whispered in exclusive clubs. But power, real power, was knowing when to walk away from a $500 million deal and not look back. By the time she reached her penthouse, her mind had already moved beyond anger. It was strategic now, clear, sharp, focused. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat beneath the soft light of her office, the city sprawling beneath her like a living map, and she reviewed every document, every clause of the pending deal with surgical precision. Her legal team had done their job well. She had options and she knew how to use them. Jade wasn't a woman who made decisions in haste. But she wasn't one to tolerate disrespect either. Not when she had built her company from the ground up, brick by digital brick, in an industry that had tried at every turn to ignore her. She had taken their silence and built an empire with it. Her phone buzzed, emails, pings, calendar alerts. The Whitmore lawyer had sent a bland, tone-deaf message through official channels, "We apologize for any discomfort experienced at last night's dinner. The family looks forward to finalizing the partnership." No sincerity. No acknowledgement of the insult. Just a thin coat of corporate gloss over a gaping wound. She didn't respond. Instead, she summoned her executive team for an emergency video call. Even at 3 a.m. they answered. That was the kind of loyalty Jade inspired, earned through transparency, fairness, and an unshakable moral compass. She informed them of her decision with calm authority. "I'm walking away from the Whitmore deal," she said. The silence that followed was not resistance. It was respect. They knew her. They trusted her. And as she laid out her reasoning, values over valuation, legacy over leverage, they listened not as employees but as allies. Within 24 hours, Jade had called a press conference. Her publicist tried to advise against it, tried to phrase things delicately, but Jade was done with diplomacy that bent to arrogance. She knew the risks, knew the headlines would swirl. CEO rejects $500 million deal over dinner insult. They'd frame it as emotional, impulsive. But she didn't care. Because this wasn't just business. This was identity. This was principle. The morning of the conference, she stood behind a sleek podium, a single cream-colored blazer draped over her shoulders like armor. Reporters flashed photos and murmured among themselves, not knowing what to expect. Jade's voice when she spoke was even, measured, powerful. "When dignity is denied," she said, "no amount of money can justify silence." Her words dropped into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples through every corporate office, every university lecture hall, every young woman watching behind a cracked screen with hope in her eyes. "I am formally withdrawing from the Whitmore partnership. Effective immediately." And just like that, the deal was dead. But something else had just begun. Something far more valuable than the ink of any contract. The press conference ended, but the impact was only beginning to unfold. As Jade stepped away from the podium, the room erupted into chaos. Reporters shouting over each other, camera shutters snapping like rain, microphones reaching toward her as if desperate to catch the heat still clinging to her final words. But she said nothing more. She didn't need to. Her silence was the punctuation mark on a sentence the world hadn't been ready to hear. Integrity is not for sale. By the time she returned to her office, the news had already detonated across every major outlet. The headlines varied in tone, some stunned, others scandalized, but none could deny the magnitude of what had just happened. Tech CEO walks away from $500 million deal after public insult. Dignity over dollars. Jade Okoro makes bold stand against Whitmore Empire. The cost of disrespect. Try 18% drop in stock value. Within hours, social media had caught fire. A short video clip, leaked anonymously, later revealed to be from a waiter working the Whitmore event, captured the exact moment Charles Jr. had delivered his cruel jibe. The angle was shaky, but the audio was crystal clear. His voice echoed, smug and dismissive. "Did someone let the help in early?" Followed by uncomfortable laughter, and Jade's quiet, graceful exit. The internet didn't take kindly to what it saw. On TikTok, on Instagram, on Twitter. No X as it had been recently rebranded. Hashtags exploded like wildfire. Hashtag respect is priceless. Hashtag we stand with Jade. Hashtag boycott Whitmore. Influencers posted reactions. Women in boardrooms shared their own stories of silent slights and gaslit humiliation, and celebrities, some cautious, others fiery, voiced their support with carefully crafted posts. But amidst the waves of outrage, there was something deeper, admiration. Not for theatrics, but for restraint. Jade hadn't thrown a tantrum. She hadn't named names or published exposés. She had walked away with quiet strength, letting her actions, not accusations, speak. That struck a nerve. Investors weren't immune to the cultural current. Within 24 hours, Whitmore stock had plummeted by 18%. Brands under the conglomerate began facing consumer boycotts, and marketing teams scrambled to rewrite ad campaigns and issue statements. But none of it felt genuine. It was damage control, and the public could smell the fear beneath the polish. Meanwhile, Jade's company was experiencing the opposite effect. Website traffic surged. Inquiries poured in. And more than a dozen new partnership offers landed in her inbox, this time from firms that led with respect, not legacy. They didn't want to simply acquire her brand. They wanted to align with it. The difference was everything. Inside the Whitmore estate, panic bloomed. Charles Sr. made a rare television appearance, reading from a visibly rehearsed apology that lacked the raw humanity people were desperate to hear. His voice was steady but soulless, full of corporate remorse but devoid of empathy. Charles Jr., on the other hand, had vanished from public view, suspended from the board, his name scrubbed quietly from digital pamphlets and future projects. But the internet never forgets. His image, frozen in that smug, champagne-laced sneer, had already become a symbol of what arrogance looks like when stripped bare. But Jade wasn't watching the chaos unfold. She didn't need to. While others obsessed over stock prices and PR firestorms, she remained still, anchored in her truth, untouched by the noise. Her decision wasn't a play for public favor. It had come from a place far more personal. And yet, that truth resonated far beyond what she had imagined. The fallout was swift. The message was louder. And the world, for once, was listening. Behind the towering iron gates of the Whitmore estate, once a symbol of grandeur and generational prestige, the silence was no longer dignified. It was suffocating. The marble halls that had echoed with laughter and clinking crystal were now filled with frantic footsteps, whispered meetings, and a growing, inescapable sense of unraveling. The air had changed. The empire, built over decades on exclusivity, inheritance, and reputation, was crumbling, not from external attack, but from a single wound that refused to close: arrogance. The fallout from Jade Okoro's departure had been swift and merciless. What the Whitmores had dismissed as an overreaction had ignited into a cultural reckoning. Business channels ran segments dissecting the family's outdated values, the tone-deaf apology, the smugness of entitlement. Editorials branded them as tone-deaf relics in an age that demanded accountability. For a dynasty that had once controlled narratives with wealth and access, the loss of control felt like freefall. Charles Whitmore Sr., the aging patriarch, watched helplessly as the board called an emergency session without him. His once commanding presence, now diminished beneath the weight of scandal, carried no more than ceremonial influence. His carefully curated legacy was tarnished, not by scandal of financial fraud or market failure, but by something far more human: disrespect. And the world, it seemed, would no longer tolerate it. He gave the apology, of course, dragged in front of cameras, dressed in remorse like an uncomfortable suit. But his words were hollow, rehearsed, and far too late. The public didn't want contrition from a script. They wanted humility. And the Whitmores had never learned how to bow. Charles Jr., the one who had set it all in motion with a single vile sentence, was no longer the golden heir. In boardrooms and back channels, he became a liability. Sponsors pulled out. Speaking engagements disappeared. Charities declined associations. He was suspended indefinitely from the family's holdings, quietly exiled under the guise of personal leave. But his name was already etched into the public's memory, not as a visionary, but as a warning. Even within their own ranks, fractures began to show. Longtime allies of the family, those who had once attended their galas and toasted their power, now kept their distance. Partnerships dissolved overnight. Young executives who had once idolized the Whitmore brand now viewed it as an emblem of rot, of an empire that mistook tradition for superiority. The estate itself, long a symbol of opulence, grew darker. Staff left in waves, unable to endure the stress and shame of association. Lawsuits loomed, discrimination claims, labor violations, whispers of internal misconduct now coming to light with a spotlight Jade had unintentionally turned on them. The dynasty's inner circle had built its castle on silence, and now that silence was broken, the walls trembled. But perhaps the cruelest consequence of all was the one the Whitmores never anticipated: irrelevance. In a world racing forward, they had clung to the past. Now, as new voices rose, diverse, dynamic, unafraid, the Whitmores found themselves mute. The very platforms they once dominated were filled with conversations they no longer understood, movements they couldn't manipulate, leaders like Jade whose currency was principle, not pedigree. In boardrooms across the country, the story became cautionary. Power without empathy was no longer enough. Brand without integrity could not survive. And so the Whitmores, once giants, became ghosts in their own legacy, watched from a distance, whispered about, studied as a lesson in how swiftly the world punishes those who forget their humanity. And through it all, Jade never spoke their name again. She didn't have to. Her silence, dignified and unwavering, was louder than any retribution. It echoed in every deal they lost, every shareholder that fled, every mirror they now struggled to look into. Because in the end, it wasn't just a business deal they had lost. They had lost the future. Weeks passed, but the tremors of Jade Okoro's decision had not faded. They had deepened, expanded, taken root in places far beyond any boardroom or business headline. What had begun as a singular moment of refusal, of choosing dignity over dollars, blossomed into a movement that no one, not even Jade herself, could have fully anticipated. The invitations began pouring in. Conferences, summits, leadership forums. Universities requested her presence on campus panels. Mentorship programs named scholarships after her. But it was the Global Leadership Summit that truly crystallized her place in history. She stepped onto the stage wearing a simple ivory dress, no frills, no designer label flashing. Just presence, grace, power wrapped in stillness. The auditorium, packed with the world's most influential thinkers, fell silent as she took the mic. And then she spoke, not with fire or fury, but with calm, measured certainty. Her words did not aim to wound, they aimed to wake. She didn't speak of revenge or reputation. She spoke of respect. When power demands your silence, she said, her voice steady as light, walking away isn't weakness, it's a declaration. Of self-worth, of boundaries, of truth. Success means nothing if it costs you your dignity. There were no roaring theatrics, no finger-pointing. She never once uttered the name Whitmore. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room, and millions more watching the live stream, knew exactly what she meant. And in that moment, Jade ceased to be just a CEO. She became a mirror, reflecting both who we are and who we aspire to be. Her speech, titled The Cost of Dignity, became the most watched keynote in the summit's history. It was clipped and shared endlessly, by young professionals hungry for guidance, by women of color finally feeling seen, by corporate leaders rethinking their cultures. Her name became synonymous not with rebellion, but with quiet revolution. And while the Whitmores faded into obscurity, nursing the wounds of their shattered dynasty, Jade's star only rose brighter. Her company flourished not just because of profit but because of principle. It became a haven for innovators who believed in more than bottom lines. Diversity wasn't a quota, it was their superpower. Inclusion wasn't a slogan, it was their strategy. But Jade never chased the spotlight. She declined half the interviews, turned down book deals that wanted to sensationalize the incident. She didn't want to be famous. She wanted to be useful. Instead, she launched a foundation focused on ethical leadership and mentorship for marginalized entrepreneurs. She poured herself into shaping a future where no one would have to make the kind of choice she did, between wealth and self-worth. Young women, especially Black girls, began to write her letters. They told her how they saw themselves in her quiet strength, how her story gave them permission to speak up, to walk away, to believe that their voice had value even when no one clapped for it. Jade read every letter. She answered as many as she could. Because more than her empire, more than her influence, they were her legacy. And perhaps that is what made her a symbol. Not the moment she said no, but everything she chose to build afterward. She showed the world that leadership is not about domination, but about alignment. About having the courage to refuse a seat at the wrong table, and then building your own, so others can sit with pride beside you. Years from now, History would record her name alongside pioneers and pathbreakers. Not for the empire she built, but for the line she refused to cross. Because in the end, Jade Okoro didn't just change the game. He changed the rules.